All right, today we are looking at Roy Lichtenstein is specifically and how we can incorporate a little bit of what Roy did in our um, designs. We're looking at how we create these graphic novels and how we're going to be incorporating fine art and that graphic novel idea combined. Last week we kind of looked at storytelling, how you can tell stories through art. We're kind of continuing that. The whole progress of this semester is creating a story using imagery that you all create. They talk a lot about comic strips, um, and so comic strips have a little bit to do. They're going to focus on a lot. We're not going to focus so much on making a little 4 or 5 panel comic strip. We're going to kind of look at the idea of how can we develop our artistic style in a graphic novel way that we can create stories of any length. They don't have to be just a little 3 or 4 or 5 panel comic. It might be in a more involved sort of graphic novel that you end up doing or wanting to work in. So one of the reasons we look at pop artists, these are artists who sort of respond to that popular culture, what was going on at the time. And so we see that there were a lot of artists who began using that popular culture and bringing it into fine arts using things like graphic images. We see designers like Andy Warhol bringing in those design elements like uh, the soup can, the Campbell soup cans, bringing in imagery from Mickey Mouse and other iconic things that were going on, Marilyn Monroe, but a reflection of what was popular at the time. And we're going to see that Roy does sort of that same sort of thing. Um, we're going to take a look though at that progress of so how Roy became went from a traditional sort of artist doing more traditional sorts of drawings and paintings to uh, his evolution into this graphic art. Anyone can learn the skills it takes to be an artist, but not everyone can create things in the world that the whole world will appreciate. One pop artist, Roy Lichtenstein, was able to produce works that made him famous. He was formerly trained as an artist in several art schools. His comic strip-like images are what other artists and non-artists appreciate. I will say we appreciate a lot of the different stuff he worked, not just those comic strip-like images. And so they talk about his inspiration being a challenge from his son, but really, when we look at the progression of Roy's work, you'll see he's responding to the artist at the time. And so let's look at where did it go here? Uh-oh. Yeah. So let's look at if you come into the module here, you can go into what they call the image duplicator. This is sort of their um, the history of Roy's artwork, and you can kind of see his progressions. And so we can start in the 1940s, and we can kind of look at sort of what his drawings were looking like in the 40s. And we see that these are very reminiscent of almost like what Van Gogh was creating at the time. But I want to do a direct comparison to some of the work of Pablo Picasso. And so we're going to look at Picasso's work and maybe how Roy is responding a lot to these Cubist influences and other artists that worked in sort of the similar style either before or just at the same time that he was working. And so we see that Picasso, as early as the early 1900s, was working in this Cubist style. He and Duchamp and other artists were beginning to explore the idea of looking at their subject matter from multiple angles, um, deconstructing, breaking down, segmenting the things that they looked at, and showing them in a different way that we hadn't seen before. And so, as we look at Roy's work, we can kind of see that to a certain extent, he is also doing some of that. If we look as he progresses through, and this is a very reminiscent of Gauguin and this as well. And so, if we look at the work of Gauguin, you see he's kind of emulating some of these other artists that were working in around the time. This is a painting he did called Indian and Horse. And if we look at it, you can kind of see that it's very, very reminiscent of Pablo Picasso's Guernica. This is Guernica by Picasso. And you can see the similar use of shape and line, color, even. And so we see that while they talk about a little bit about that, the influence of his son, challenging him, Roy was a serious artist who progressed along with the other artists that were working in that genre at that time. And so you can kind of see as we look through the 50s, 60s, the 70s, all the way up through the 90s, his artwork begins to evolve. And it's in those 60s, late 50s, early 60s, that we really begin to see the influence of this graphic novel, these comic book like influences. And we see them here. And so, for instance, when we look at what makes it that comic book like style, we're looking at how he uses bold line, the black outline, the use of pattern, again, in printing, very often pattern supplemented color. So you might have two or three colors to work with, but by combining it with pattern, you can create lots of different values and colors and so forth. And so that's what we see him doing here. As we look at his work as it progresses through the 70s, again, we see that bold use of these primary and secondary colors. The bull here, again, is very reminiscent of the cubism that we saw Picasso. And by this time, Picasso's kind of work is at its end. But that's what he was kind of doing, was deconstructing things to the most simple forms. If we look at the work of Mondrian, it's very reminiscent of what we see here as he's breaking these bull down from the bull to the more simplified, incredibly simplified. Oh my goodness, that's very simple. So we can see literally his progression within those genres. We're going to jump ahead to 91 and kind of take a look at how this all applies to what we're going to do with our make day and making some art. And we're going to look at how Roy created these interior spaces, these two-dimensional interior spaces where graphic designers, interior designers were using these types of images to demonstrate what work would look like. But Roy's using it as a fine art. He's taken those design elements, those skills that would mostly be used by designers, again, to demonstrate to a client how, like an architect might, how their final product would look when they purchase or hire their services. Roy's going beyond just a simple sketch. Let me show you what I can do. And he's showing us that those designers, those illustrators, are creating fine art. Same way, in the same way that, well, other artists were doing at the time, like Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol's doing the same thing. And so Roy's showing us that those artists, those designers, or graphic designers, are exactly as legitimate of artists as painters like Picasso. So that is what we're going to be looking at in our make day. We're going to be creating an interior space that looks at using single point perspective, simplified primary secondary color, use of pattern, and how we can incorporate that two-dimensional storytelling into our graphic novels. Okay, let's take a look at the make day soon.